want to thank all the group at SISEMA, especially Anna and Marcia and Sylvia, for bringing me back again. So thank you so much. I feel very honored to be able to participate in yet another celebration for your city. So thank you. This is a, I also see that the symposium was designed very carefully, moving very logically from one paper to the next. We finished with Egypt last time, and now we're at ISIS. So we're still on theme.
Yeah.
So my paper is going to talk, it's titled Shaping Historical Knowledge for a Digital Infrastructure. Infrastructure is the key term here, and it might better be titled Shaping Infrastructure for Historical Knowledge. And so it's worthwhile keeping in mind that there's quite a lot of sort of consideration of what it means to do digital scholarship here. That's what I want to begin with. So in my view, we are all digital historians. Right? There is a tendency for some people to say, well, I don't know how to code. I'm not into digital humanities or digital history. But we all use word processors. We all use database searches at email, at conferences. We use PowerPoint slides. People blog and tweet. We take digital photos when we go to visit archives. Most of us will also do some kind of digital organization of the material that we collect. So we are all in some way or another digital scholars. And that's a really important thing to consider, because what I want to talk about may seem quite technical in places, although I'll try to gloss over the complexities of it. I think it's very important for everybody to understand some of the reasons why digital work is done the way it is, and why it's really, really hard to turn historical research and historical presentation into machine-readable data that we can work with. So, as I said, I'm talking about infrastructure here. We need to understand how the media that we use, in this case the digital media that we use, shapes and reshapes our discipline. And my work as the ISIS bibliographer has drawn me into a much deeper understanding of this, and I'll explain why as we go along. But my conclusion is that we need to consciously build an infrastructure for ourselves. I want us all to consider what it means to make the digital space that we work in work better for historians and historical research and historical presentation. Finally, I want to say that I think infrastructure includes more than just cables and data standards. Infrastructure is people as well. And it is human infrastructure that may be some of the most difficult parts of our infrastructure to transform. Okay, so I work with, I was hired in 2002 to do the ISIS bibliography for the history of science, a secondary source in a secondary bibliography that has been going on since 1913. When I started, it was primarily a paper publication that had a digital presence, and I have, over the last few years, with the help of some extensive funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, been able to create an open access digital resource that I call IsisCB Explore, and that is free to access by anyone at any time. And it's still in development, but the major pieces are there. In doing this project, I've learned a lot about how to make the difficulties of creating digital work. So let's begin. Here is three citations from one of the bibliographies that I published recently. And so one looks at this and thinks, well, that's pretty straightforward. This bibliographical knowledge is among the most rigidly codified kind of knowledge that we have as historians. There are standards and they're applied usually pretty carefully. So you can look at one of these and pretty quickly understand what it means. So one would think that this would be really pretty easy to code and make available online. It's relatively easy to get some of it up there, but as you begin to try to do some of the things that I want to do, it's clear that it becomes harder and harder, and I want to show you why it is so hard. So first of all, I want you to consider that this is a test case, what might be considered a simple test case for digitizing historical knowledge. And I guess the other thing I should say is that some of the points that I may make here might sound obvious, but the fact that they sound obvious may be a reason to give them special consideration, because they may seem like, oh, it's easy to, I know that, but what are the implications of that? What are the real deeper implications of it? So I want us to focus on sometimes fairly obvious things. The thing that I want to do here is now show you this term. See the top, okay, well yeah, that's fine. This is the one I want. So the top citation, Martin Craig, Alchemy, and the Renaissance commentary tradition on meteorologica. So that's the citation. If we look at it in IsisCB Explore, it looks like this. And notice that it also is pretty simple to read. In fact, this is the kind of thing that we have all, as digital historians, come to get used to reading. Nobody looked at citations like that 50 years ago. It was always what I showed you earlier, or variations thereof. But now we expect fields and labels to be pretty evident. And so we've learned how to read this. And we have over here, at the far end, various attributes that I have provided for that record. I call them authorities. And the authority structure that I have created is going to be one of the most important things to pay attention to here. So here is a new expression of a bibliographical record. Here is another expression of the bibliographical record, which you can get to by putting your cursor on that and clicking on that, and you get this thing, which is a JSON representation of it. Now, nobody's going to read this. This isn't easy to read, but this is the machine-readable version that you can get. And if you have an application that you want to use that will automatically grab data from my bibliography, this is what you need. So this is the next level down that we need to pay attention to as historians. So coding it just for presentation in those fields isn't enough. We now have to pay attention to various kinds of very specific kinds of labeling in particular formats. And the reason for that is, and here's the second, this is the second kind of presentation. This is the sort of the other aspect that I want to, the other framework that I want to have us think about. There's internal infrastructure and external infrastructure. So I'm talking here now about communicating outside of the bibliography. So what does it take to make my program communicate with other programs? That turns out to be the most difficult kind of problem. So this is one structure. You put your data into very rigid, defined standards like JSON. I want to conclude this section with a comment about curation. Of course, getting the data into the bibliography doesn't happen automatically. It's done, especially in my system, manually. And we can collect a lot of records en masse, but we have to individually curate them, to clean them up. And so we have to create pages like this on the backside in order to be able to make those things work. So if we're talking about infrastructure that works, that creates complete systems, you've got to realize that there's a backside to the system that is invisible to everybody, except for the people who are working with it. And that backside, it turns out, as I learned very much the last 6 months, sometimes takes a lot longer to put together so that it works well than the front side. The front side came up and we were up and running, and then it took me probably 9 months to get the back side going so that I like it, and I still don't like it the way it is. But it's much better. So let me kind of give you a sense of what a page does now on my system. So this is a bibliographic record, and it's got links here where it's got links here where you might expect them. There's a link that goes to the author. There's a link that goes to the publisher, etc. And it goes to the publisher within my system. So I'll tell you about that in a minute. And then, so you can download citations in a reference manager. If you use EndNote or Zotero or something like that, you can collect that information in your reference manager. You can submit new entries to the bibliography. You can tweet or share things on Facebook from this page. You can link to external resources. So there's an external resource right here, linked data. You can comment. There's a comment section here. And you can actually find this at your library if your library is configured in the right way. So all of those things require on the back end lots of stuff, lots of coding. Some of these are fairly standard. Twitter and Facebook, you can grab that stuff from the Twitter and Facebook pages because they want you to be able to share things well. So that's just code you add in a fairly straightforward manner to your web page. But there are other things, downloading citations to a reference manager, that takes a lot of thought. Once again, we're talking about standards that need to be followed. Enabling library link resolvers also requires a certain amount of coding that is not always obvious. So those are the kinds of things that are, this is in the HTML of every single page that you pull up, right? All of these little functions there. Now I want to shift from data infrastructure, which I think is how you might best call what I've talked about, how the data is configured, to something that I think we should call semantic infrastructure. This is the way that the data, this is where the meaning of the data comes and how I have decided these records ought to be related to each other. And in a nutshell, I have created two kinds of records: citation records, which are the ones that we've been looking at, and authority records, which are records that represent not just subjects, not just subjects and classifications, but journals, publishers, and authors. If you now recognize that every citation is connected to multiple authorities, and every authority then is, most authorities are connected to multiple citations, you end up with something like this, a network graph, which all of us are probably familiar with in some form or fashion. And here you see how some authority records, here's one down here, this authority record is an author of one record, but the subject of another record. Maybe it's Albert Einstein, who happens to have been given an authorship in one and a subject of another. So that's the kind of thing that there's another level of complexity here. If you pay attention to that level of complexity, if you structure things in this way, then you can do fancier things. And these are things that are not yet implemented, but that are now possible, given the network graph, the semantic infrastructure that I have created. And that is timelines. So here, if I want to know, here's Ugo Baldini, and his timeline of publications is here. Here's a timeline that shows the number of publications every year that he had, and here's a timeline that's weighted, so it gives greater weight to books and less weight to reviews. So you can, different ways of thinking about that. So at some point in the near future, I intend to have this kind of material.
What's the second one?
The second one? This is a weighted timeline.
How do you weight it?
I say a book equals 4 points, a review equals 1/3 of a point, an essay review is 2/3, etc. So I made up stuff. And the weighting may not be correct, but at least it gives me right now something to think about. Right. And I think it gives you a better sense of the intensity of scholarship that went into a particular object. Okay. And other things you can do is you could go to the authority record for the journal, the American Historical Review, and see how many publications I have in my bibliography related to history of science that are from that review, from that journal. So this could be very useful for someone trying to figure out, well, have I covered everything in this particular journal? If you can look at the graph and say, wait a minute, Weldon is missing 3 years in the 2000s. We've got to contact him and get him to put that stuff in there. But it gives you a sense of context. And all of these kinds of things, I think, are ways of providing context to the material simply by looking at the larger infrastructure, the internal infrastructure of the bibliography. If you're now thinking about the external infrastructure, this is not a very good slide, but down here is a representation from my record, Alexander Kostov. And Alexander Kostov has a VIAF number. VIAF is a virtual international authority file, which has been established by librarians worldwide as a file that will affirm that a particular person is it will affirm the authority of a particular person. So if there's a question about which one, I'm telling you it's this guy in the VIAF record. So there are ways now internationally, globally, to communicate with each other. But now this takes a lot of work. Trying to find out which person we're talking about globally is really intensive. I mentioned a few minutes ago curatorial functionality. If we're talking about linking people, one of the things we can do is we can go to appel here, and we're trying to figure out which appel this is. Here's one with 22 records, and here's another one with 5 records. The curation interface that I've designed allows you to see what other publications are connected to this particular authority record. In this case, it looks like one of the things that needs to happen is those 2 authority records probably need to be merged. So, but that's the kind of thing that exists with all data. Very quickly, I want to just mention the Cumulative Bibliography, which is a second project that I have worked on, which is now online and accessible at cumulative.isiscb.org. And this is a series of HTML pages. Each page is the full contents of a roughly 500 to 700 page bibliography covering different periods. So 1913 to 1965, persons, A through J, 62 through 65, etc. Frank James can tell us a lot more about this because he worked on the print version of this with Magna Litro, and it's an extraordinary resource. Without that, I wouldn't have been able to do what I'm going to tell you I'm intending to do. So from going from open access HTML pages, which look like this when you look at it online, to this when you look at the code behind it. Let's zoom in on one of those. You'll see that the code behind it has tagged various parts of that bibliographic information. So we have isolated the title, we've isolated the author, we've isolated the date. And there's some other things that we obviously need to isolate, but we haven't yet been able to do that. So where we have isolated things using automated scripting for the roughly 70,000 records that we had, 90,000, we've done that. Finally, a couple things. Okay, great. Which means I have 5 minutes before the end of the session. Yes. Okay. Well then, let me wrap this up very quickly. There are some meta-level visualizations that I think we can look toward in the future. So I've done some of these by hand just to kind of see what we might do. So here, number of history of science related dissertations by school over time. Wouldn't it be great to have timelines like this when you're going back and forth between citations to find out something more about the discipline? Or something like this. I found out when I did a search of the top 150 most indexed names of people, there were 3 women. You can't even see them on this because they're too small, but they're there. Émilie du Châtelet, Marie Curie, and Margaret Cavendish. That tells us something. And other things. So for example, percentage of single authored articles has been going down as the percentage of double and triple authored articles has been going up in recent years. And then I'm going to skip these other slides, which are more general, to sort of summarize what I think we need. We need to have infrastructure at the data side, at the data level, data standards. We need to have infrastructure at the semantic level, so semantic standards that we can begin to agree upon. We need to have infrastructure at the institutional level and at the discipline level. People who are willing to fund and respect these kinds of things, and people who can teach each other skills and help. We need training and various sorts of things like that. So that's where I'll stop, and I'll ask for questions. Thank you.